Okay, so I went on a teaching course a year and a bit ago, and it said that when it's getting late on, the best thing to do to ensure people pay attention is to start with audience participation. So, are people familiar with the monorail episode of The Simpsons? Okay, need to check just to make sure I'm not massively out of touch. So, if you were in an African village and a fellow from the World Bank comes along and says, we're going to build you an irrigation scheme which is going to be 30,000 hectares, what would you expect to happen at the end of the 6 years or so of construction? How much of that irrigation scheme would you expect to be finished and operational? So, Tim, Ravitsa, Sarah, and Roshan are exempt from this question. They hopefully should have a vague idea. How many people would expect around 80 to 100% of that to be operational? No. Okay. 60 to 80%? That's one. Very optimistic there. Glass half full on that side. 40 to 60? 20 to 40? 20 to 40? And 0 to 20. Okay, so we're not too. This is a good method of judging how optimistic an audience is in terms of overall. Because I did this at another conference, a generic land use conference, and everyone was in the 80 to 100%. So they were very optimistic. So this idea that you have a water basin or a river basin, you come in and then you put a dam or a pumping station in. You have some investment associated with it, some new development is quite an old strategy now that we are quite used to, this idea of river basin management, integrated basin management. And this goes back to, originally at least, the Tennessee Valley Authority in the southern states. So this was part of the New Deal in the 1930s to deal with big, large-scale unemployment, and they built a massive number of dams, in total about 30 to 40 dams along the Tennessee Valley. And originally they were producing a lot of power for not a lot. Then there was a rather sudden demand for aluminium for aircraft in the 40s. And they were helpfully located near the Department of Energy station, which started producing the uranium for the Manhattan Project. So that was the big initiation in the US. And then this got brought over to Africa at about the same time, initially by the colonial authorities. So the main one that people will go to is normally the Nile, but I think the Office to Niger scheme in Mali is a better example. So the Makala barrage that goes across the Niger there, that raises the level behind the barrage and forces the water up a relict confluence of the Niger. So this is a satellite image, and you can see down here, this bright green is some more modern refurbished irrigation scheme section, some central pivot points you can see there in circles. And further north is some of the older sections. So this was built by the French colonial authorities to provide a fairly sizable amount of rice plantations. And they were very ambitious here. Originally, they'd sort of wanted around 900,000 hectares. So this would have been really, really big if it had delivered all of that. It didn't, which I guess is going to be a recurring theme, but it was a very grand ambition at least. And then across in Sudan, the British authorities, initially this had begun around the First World War, when we couldn't import cotton from India because of blockades. So started producing cotton in Gezira, just south of Khartoum. And this extended massively in the 1920s and 30s, and then again in the 60s and 70s, and became a really, really sizable irrigation scheme. And this is probably one of the examples that people initially think of when they think of river basin management, but it's probably one of the latter examples, really. And then, so these are two in more North Africa, but then there was also Italian developments in what's now Somalia at the time on the Juba River, and then some other ones further down in Kenya. But then come the 1960s to around the early 1990s was when this mode of development really kicked off. And this was funded by the World Bank and later on by the African Development Bank in association with European and American aid and development agencies. And the model of this was fairly consistent across most countries. There would be a proposal between the country, the World Bank, and all the aid agencies, who would write some fairly sizable checks to go to the country. These would be managed by the National Agricultural Irrigation Authority, who would employ a European or US contractor engineering firm, companies such as McDonald in the UK or Halcro, or the Italian firm Cellini, which were probably the most prevalent across Africa. And this European contractor would then run the construction of either a dam or a pumping station, the associated irrigation scheme, and quite often as well the resettlement of people that were displaced by the development. And as you can see from the graph, 1950s, particularly in Southeast Asia, kicked off, and then Africa kicking off a bit later, although never reaching quite the same level of development as was common in Southeast Asia. But then by the early 1990s, as we know, this got problematic, and it was effectively stopped by the World Bank. So the World Bank's World Commission on Dams was very critical of how a lot of these developments happened. Colleagues on the FutureDAMS projects like Bill Adams and Richard Parham-Jones published a lot of work showing that these developments had a lot of unintended consequences, both on people working on these schemes, people near these schemes, and the wider sort of environment and the river basins that they were operating in. And also by the 1990s, you can see along here, world food prices had kind of started to stabilize and were not increasing at the rate they had been in the 70s and the 80s. So this led to a bit more of a relaxation on the drive to increase a lot more food. And if you were very cynical, you would say, well, the Soviet Union had collapsed by this point and there wasn't such geopolitical incentive to stop people revolting, but never mind. And then protests like the one there, that's from a dam in Pakistan, I think, were becoming a lot more common. And there was a big international movement from Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, similar organizations, against these large-scale infrastructure developments. But things are picking up again. So in Ghana, the Bui Dam, which has just been finished a few years ago, is in the process of constructing a 30,000 hectare irrigation scheme. The Beluga Dam, which is being proposed near where Roche and Sarah have been working, is proposing an irrigation scheme of 20,000 hectares. And then there's various other ones in Nigeria, in Kenya, and Tanzania, where people are proposing really seriously large irrigation schemes again. So this is probably a good time to start looking holistically at the schemes that existed previously and think, well, why did they disappoint? What was the underlying problem, and has this been addressed? And if you look in the literature for why irrigation schemes have failed, and I'm going to include irrigation schemes in the biggest context here, it doesn't have to be with a dam, it's just that's a fairly common mode of development, but pumping from rivers or lakes is also quite common. You can find basically any reason for a scheme to have failed or to have underdelivered. There are basically anything that can go wrong somewhere will have gone wrong and will have been blamed by somebody. So maybe the climate, maybe we just didn't understand it in the 60s, the records weren't long enough, or maybe the climate became unexpectedly poor, there wasn't enough rain, there wasn't enough river flow. Maybe the schemes were just badly designed, maybe the governments didn't know what they were doing, maybe people just didn't maintain them. Governments are corrupt, they planted the wrong crops, the farmers didn't know what they were doing. Maybe Africa is just generically difficult in terms of the geology and the soil, and engineering is just always going to be hard. Or maybe it's more of a labour market economic issue that we don't understand what people were doing and how that can be integrated into a scheme development. So the point I'm making here is just that whatever it is that people can think of it, it has been proposed for the reason. But there hasn't been an awful lot of work looking at lots of schemes from across the continent in Africa and going, well, why, on the whole, did things disappoint, and what, if it's done differently, might help? So that's what we're looking at doing here, is have dams in Africa and irrigation schemes delivered the agricultural benefits that were promised? Have they got better at doing that over time? And what factors have contributed to any relative under, or potentially over, if you're optimistic, performance? And how does this relate to wider FutureDAMS work looking at how we design water energy megasystems in the future? So the first thing I spent a lot of time doing is reading documents like this. So this is the recent batch of World Bank declassified reports that they produced for all of their developments across Africa. So you now go onto the World Bank website, and they have all of these typewritten documents that have been scanned, and you can search them, and they're fairly well organized. So you don't need to go and spend a month in New York combing archives, fortunately. So this is an example from the Semri Rice project, which is done in the northeast of Cameroon, near the border with Nigeria. And on the first page there, very nicely says, we're going to build an irrigation scheme to serve 3,000 hectares and rehabilitate an existing 1,300 hectares. And they have a map here of what exists and what's going to exist that we can compare to what currently exists. So 3,000 hectares is quite large by most estimations, I think, for an irrigation scheme. But it's notable that they're already in 1971 having to rehabilitate what is already there. So this is a theme, I think, which comes down a lot in this work, is that nothing is ever fully finished. What's that bridge in Scotland where they paint it one way? Forth Bridge, yeah. And then they stop and then they just paint back the other way. It's a similar sort of issue. So digging through the World Bank archives on this, we managed to get 71 schemes from across Africa. So if you look at this and squint, you can sort of see the distribution of major river basins. So this is the Niger River and the various ones that go into Lake Chad and the Niger Delta, and the Volta River, the Senegal River, various ones in Ethiopia, the Juba River in Somalia. And we got these from the late 1940s until the early 2000s. So we stopped with schemes that were to be constructed after sort of 2008 so that they have time to get up and operational. And the size of these schemes varies from a couple of hundred hectares up to the Office to Niger scheme, which was 900,000 hectares there. So we have a fairly good range. And looking at the years in which they were constructed, it fits with broadly what you would expect, with a few in the colonial period and the post-colonial period, and then a big expansion by the 1980s, and then a tapering off into the 90s as these investments were discouraged. And then to get maps of what is actually irrigated to compare against the proposals, we use some satellite imagery, some Landsat data, which is 30-meter resolution. Training this with Google Earth imagery to get maps of how frequently these areas are irrigated. And we used 5 years worth of data to make an irrigation frequency map. And for our purposes, we considered something irrigated successfully if in 3 out of 5 years it was classified as irrigated. So this allows us to account for sort of fallowing periods or crop rotations that might leave areas unactively irrigated. So, firstly, have these schemes delivered what was proposed? No, not very well at all. So this is proposed area on a log scale, so from 1,000 hectares up to just shy of 1 million, and that's the percentage of that which was successfully delivered. So the mean of this is 40, the median is 18%, which is fairly low, I think, by anyone's standards. And there's a significant linear relationship where the larger a scheme proposal is, the worse the performance is. So if proposals have not been too good, surely we've got better over time. Surely we, in the late 90s and the early noughties, are much better at doing these type of things than we were in the 1940s and the 1950s. Also no. No improvement at all. So if you ever want to feel that your work and your life's calling in academia has a purpose, you can now go and read papers criticising irrigation schemes written in the late 70s and the early 80s, and know that in 30, 40 years' time, your work will also have been as completely irrelevant. Optimistic thought for the day. So there's been no improvement, no significant trend in time at all. So what has contributed to this? What has made things worse and what has sometimes made things better? So for this, we've got 11 different variables. So these are some economic ones here on the government effectiveness, some social issues around how connected they are, and a series of climatic data sets as well, covering the period from now until the 1950s. And we put this into a two-stage process, firstly using a random forest as a variable reduction selection process, and then putting them into a non-parametric model. So this is to do with having 70 sites but 11 predicted variables is quite a high predictor to sample ratios. This is a process to deal with that. And out of all of those 11 variables, only 3 of them were really properly efficient predictors. So the proposal size was very relevant, mainly before 10,000 hectares. So it decreased linearly to around 10,000 and then plateaued at around 25%. Government Effectiveness Index, which is the World Bank's composite measure of how effectively governed a country is. I appreciate that's a fairly controversial issue for lots of development people, but it covers issues such as corruption perception and the independence of the judiciary and the democratic process. And as you would probably expect, the worse governed a country is, according to this index, the worse the performance of schemes in that country will be. And then for the regions, using African Union geographic regions, the East Africa region was significantly better than all the others. All the others were about equal. And that mainly is Ethiopia and Kenya in our context. But these three variables alone were capable of explaining about 40% of the variance in our sample. So that's, I think, relatively high. I think that's reasonably good. So, interestingly, one factor that is not there is any of the climate variables. We included variables on rainfall or water balance change and aridity conditions there. And this is something that would have been expected, because this is nearly always mentioned in lots of different contexts, that this scheme failed because we didn't understand the climate, or the river or the lake dried up and there wasn't the water there to support the irrigation. And the textbook study on this is the schemes in the vicinity of Lake Chad. So Lake Chad's an inland river delta, just here on the border of Niger, Chad, Cameroon and Nigeria. And I'm sure people have seen these clips of Lake Chad shrinking from its peak in the 60s and then deteriorating through the 70s, the 80s, into the 2000s. I could do a separate series of lectures about why this maybe is not a very accurate map and why this idea of permanent water body shrinking or expanding is probably not very helpful, but that's a side issue. So when this area was in French colonial control, they always kind of anticipated building an irrigation scheme here. And then the World Bank funded various schemes, initially in Nigeria and Chad, but also in Cameroon in the late 60s and 70s. So this is one of the schemes that was built in the Nigeria side. This is a South Chad irrigation project. So this is a pipeline that pumped water from the lake, and then this, see this sort of like lightish colour here? This is what was some rice fields, and then if you look a bit further up, you can see some canal linings here. So as you can see from the imagery, they're not growing a lot there at the moment. So how did this scheme collapse so badly? And was it obviously to do with the climate? So Lake Chad is known as this environmental change case study where it got very dry, the lake shrunk and everything around collapsed. And this is the timeline of how this irrigation scheme came to be. So in the late 60s, the US Bureau of Land Reclamation did a feasibility study, which was then taken on by the World Bank, who did a study in 1973, I think. And then from 74 to 79, it was constructed and it was opened in time for the 1979 growing season. And then, as you can see from the rainfall graph, almost immediately after, the rainfall did decline quite drastically. But to blame this on the climate, to blame the failure of this irrigation scheme on the climate, I think is over-interpreting it. Because when you look at the actual rainfall for the region, for the first few years, it was relatively high. It wasn't lower than it was in the feasibility study. And even in the years when it first opened and the rainfall was high, it never remotely achieved anywhere near what the percentage of land irrigated was supposed to be. So rice in 1983 achieved 1-2%, and wheat achieved just shy of 25%. So the wheat might have managed to successfully irrigate quite a lot, but it was so badly managed at the time that they lost a massive amount and they had a very low yield again anyway. So yes, the rainfall did decline after it was constructed, but only several years later did it start to drop beyond the point at what should have been considered in the feasibility study. And even a few years later, when yields were already dropping and the area irrigated had not successfully raised, it was still not really lower than what it had been the year before the scheme was started to be constructed. So to say that this irrigation scheme failed because the climate was bad and wasn't helpful is, I think, blaming what happened on the climate, but it's unlikely that this would have succeeded anyway, regardless. And this was actually acknowledged by the World Bank in some of their internal memos that, yes, the scheme suffered from water availability, but if your scheme can't handle a decline in water availability that existed 2 years before you constructed it, then it's probably been badly constructed. And when you look at the governing strategies about how the Nigerian government and the regional authorities were handling this, then you come into more typical issues about management and institutions that are less straightforward than just saying it failed because of the climate. So one other thing I think is worth doing for this context is take a step back and view dams and irrigation schemes as mega projects, mega infrastructure projects. And depending on where you live or where you come from, you can find many projects of this. So if you go to London and look at the Crossrail project, which is a major infrastructure project, that's now 3.5 billion over budget, which is about 23%. It's 3 years over opening and counting, assuming it will be open in the summer, which is probably optimistic. If you go to Berlin, you can go and you land at Schönefeld Airport, which is the worst airport in Europe. You can look out and see the lovely shiny new airport they've built there, which is now 9 years overdue and 100% at 4.4 billion over budget, and is now so overdue that it's not going to be able to handle the capacity that it was supposed to, because it's been overdone for so long. So that's two examples in London and Berlin, which you would think are places that should be relatively well equipped to deal with infrastructure projects of size. And when you look at globally dams built for hydropower, nearly all of them cost more, take longer, and produce less hydropower than is expected. So 80% of dams, large hydropower dams, have a delay of 2.3 years on estimated construction time of eight years. And 96% of them, on average, there is a 96% higher than projected cost for these schemes. And these averages hide a very, very long tail as well. So it's much more likely that you have schemes which are 700-800% over budget than you have any that are under budget, which basically never happens. So this, you can look at irrigation schemes and say, yeah, they deliver a very small percentage of what they do. And this is typical of all projects. It's not unique to irrigation schemes and not unique to Africa. All infrastructure is optimistically planned and is inefficiently delivered. And that's just a function of people being very optimistic when they plan. I'm sure we've all done lots of project Gantt charts that have been outdated by the end of the week. And another issue that I think is quite key, and this is something which is overlooked, is the ideology of why you were doing this in the first place. So if we look at the semi-rice project one again, it very explicitly says in the summary and conclusion section, production from the project would serve to reduce the national rice deficit and stimulate exports to nearby countries. So this is very explicit that it's about increasing rice production for food security purposes. And this is not help farmers make money. It's not saying, let's see what farmers are doing, help them out, they can make some more money and they'll do their own investment. It's very explicitly, we want to make lots of rice. But this results in a focus on the bulk production of low-value staple crops. Low-value crops are inherently less productive, which means if you wanted to make a scheme even on paper seem economical, you have to propose large areas, which is what people do. And this contradicts how farmer-led investments will work when they're done outside of institutional frameworks, where people will focus on higher value crops, fruit, vegetables, cotton. In Africa, and even in Europe and the US, this is not how food security political aims would be achieved. In the UK, we don't build large infrastructure to support agriculture. You just pay farmers a subsidy to produce something and subsidize it from taxpayers. So this idea that the national interest is going to be achieved by lots of smallholder farmers is probably a bit misaligned, because it results in the farmers not making any money. The scheme can't make any money, the maintenance can't be supported, and then problems can go on from there. But there is an exception to this, which is sugar, primarily in Eastern Africa. In our sample size, this was mainly in Kenya. Sugar is obviously a fairly high-value crop, and it enjoys a strong state support because it's a high-value crop which has good export value. And it's also a labour-intensive crop over a technology-intensive crop, so there's less incentive for people to start advocating in proposals that they're going to do a very large irrigation scheme for sugar and we're going to put tractors on it, because it's much more feasible just to have lots of people do work on it. So sugar is maybe the exception cause, and I've seen case studies, and Jenny, who visited a few months ago, it was before Christmas, wasn't it, was talking the same about flowers in Ethiopia and Kenya. So very high value crops that involve a lot of manual labour are maybe the exception to this. And we can see that out of the relatively small number of schemes that did overperform, a lot of them, a majority of them are associated with sugar production, either entirely or at least in part. And then government effectiveness. So this is a complicated thing to measure because how you measure the effectiveness of a government is very subjective. But it's fairly obvious that in current day Somalia, you are going to have limited ability to support complex irrigation schemes, that's a given. But even in other countries and other contexts, irrigation projects are complicated. They involve lots of maintenance if they come with tractor equipment, for the canals, for the dams, etc. And one problem that reoccurs frequently is the nature of how these projects get funded. So the World Bank or the African Development Bank will institute an arrangement with the host country and then the centralised authority of that, Central Irrigation Authority or the Central Agricultural Authority, who will often be based in the capital and will be under-resourced, and they will have to manage the project. And this is enforced by the contracts of the funding arrangements. But these agencies are often very distant from the actual schemes in context, and they don't have the local knowledge or the ability to gain the local knowledge and insights to go and manage these effectively. So you have all these decisions being taken nowhere near where they're actually implemented, which reduces the ability of the schemes to adapt and to make adjustments that would help them run functionally. And you would have thought that was obvious, that you shouldn't build complicated developments in fragile or uncertain environments. But there's a few examples here. So that was published, the top one is published less than 3 months ago now. So the $14 billion Inga Falls Dam in the Congo, which is going to divert water from the Inga Falls waterfalls into a hydro plant. So just for context, depending on whether you use notional or real GDP, 14 billion is either about just under 10% or a third of Congo's GDP in total. So that's a fairly sizable investment for a country which is not particularly stable by most accounts. And this dam has been planned and has been pushed for a long time now. And then another example, and there's lots in this case, is in Afghanistan. So that is the Kajaki Dam in Helmand province. And this was built in the 70s with US aid funding when they were fighting against the Soviets. It was then bombed when we invaded Afghanistan, and then we rebuilt it again. So someone made a lot of money there, I'm sure. And next to this dam, not even inside it, is several $1 million worth of turbine equipment that was taken by coalition, US and coalition troops to this dam. Very expensive. It was under attack because it was very valuable. And then they could never get it installed. So these very expensive hydro turbines are just rusting in Helmand province, and the dam doesn't produce any hydropower now. But after the coalition invasion in the early noughties, they spent a lot of money trying to get these various dams up and running again on the assumption that it would stimulate economic growth, and that has not led to great success. And I'm imagining in Helmand province, there's not going to get any more successful. And then the EU is also committing, or is trying to commit, to rehabilitating various irrigation schemes in Somalia now. Even in the ongoing civil war, they have a belief that certain regions now are stable enough that these irrigation schemes can be rehabilitated and they will be successful. So a lot of these irrigation schemes are ones that were included in our sample that are producing nothing. And they were built by the Italian colonial government in the 1940s and 30s. So, yeah. You would think that not building complicated things in very difficult places would be quite apparent, but maybe not. When you think you can get shiny technocratic solutions, then it becomes quite tempting, I guess. So I guess one other question then is, why have things not got better? I could probably have done the majority of this presentation based entirely on papers that were published before I was born and not needed to use any more recent papers. So papers like Bill Adams and Richard Palmer Jones published in the 60s, the 70s and the 80s could probably have given all of this material 30 odd years ago. So one thing I did to think about why this not got better is I looked at these two proposal documents from the World Bank. So one is for the Lake Chad Polders project, which was on the north side of Lake Chad, and the other one is for a dam that's recently been finished in Ethiopia. And they basically follow exactly the same process. The introduction says, this is a semi-arid country, the rainfall is this, the soil is this, blah, 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 blah. Then it says the local people currently practice this type of agriculture where they produce this for subsistence, they export this for market, blah, 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 blah. And then they seem to jump straight from what the local people do into, we are going to build an irrigation scheme which will provide local people with 3 hectares of land where they will produce this, and we expect they will get a yield of 17 tons of rice a year, whatever. But there's never any connection between the sections detailing what local people currently do and what they will do on the irrigation scheme. It goes straight from the this is what they do to the this is what they should do under our blueprint for revitalizing the area. And this has stayed the same in over, 40 odd years now. This refusal of planning authorities to consider how they can adapt what they do to benefit local people instead of trying to get local people to adapt to what they do. So yeah, over the past 40, 50 years, we've become a lot better at building dams. But that was never really a problem. We've been able to build functioning dams for hundreds of years now. The Peak District has dams that are 250 years old, which, with a few exceptions, are functioning perfectly fine. You know, building canals is not difficult. Again, there are Roman canals in Spain that function perfectly fine. And I do think one issue that maybe was unhelpful in framing this irrigation scheme process was the relative success of Gezira and the Office to Niger schemes. So they were done very early on. They achieved large areas. So the Office to Niger scheme only actually achieved 10% of what the French wanted it to do, but it was still 100,000 hectares, which is still a good shot. So I view this as trying to live up to this dream. It's I guess it's like Oasis bringing out new albums. So because Definitely Maybe and What's the Story was so good, you know, they could bring out a perfectly good album, but it's just never going to quite live up to how good the first 2 albums were. So I think this idea that because these 2 schemes were capable of producing such large areas, we should be able to do it everywhere else, has clouded the judgment of what is realistic, achievable, or desirable. And there's still, even across these 2 documents, relatively little attention paid to the wider institutional setting about who is going to run this scheme for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And who is going to provide the maintenance for it, how is the maintenance going to be funded, and who's going to implement it, which is obviously going to be necessary. Canals require desedimentation, dams require checking on a regular basis. As an example, in the UK, every dam above a certain size is inspected every single day by a qualified engineer. And I imagine there are several of these irrigation dams have gone without proper formalised inspection, probably over 10 years in some cases. And this idea of focusing on the national aim of food security, not the individual goal of profitability for farmers, which, when you start with completely the wrong premise of we want to increase food security, when your premise should really be we want the people who work on this scheme to make as much money as possible, then you go in the wrong direction straight away. And this is an example of rendering technical, as Tanya Lee says about development projects. where this belief that you can take issues connecting to land and capital and economics, and these can effectively be sorted out by technical engineering knowledge, when they can't, because issues around capital and land are fundamentally political and socio-economic questions. They can't be solved with the best poured concrete in the world. And then there's still the entire process of how these projects are funded is still basically the same. They go to the country, the agricultural agency, to a contractor, to wherever. And it doesn't matter whether you view these ones that were constructed in colonial periods or nationalist periods or more neoliberal, inverted commas, or how you justify them. So I imagine over the next 10 years, all of the World Bank projects will say this is a sustainable development project to enable sustainable water use. But it's fundamentally the same. Nothing has actually changed in the planning process about how these figures and how these schemes are designed. So ultimately, the question should not be, why has nothing changed? The question should be, why would you expect anything to have improved? Because nothing has changed. So, in summary, irrigation schemes are bad at delivering their promised benefits. They are, even in the context of dams, which are bad at and cost more, they are very bad at delivering the area of irrigation that they propose. And this is only one angle about where they are bad. If we look at how resilient they are to climate shocks and the yields compared to what they were expected and how good they are at alleviating poverty, they generally perform fairly poorly on all measures. So, whichever way you spin it, they're not great. And nothing has changed since the 1950s. They were bad initially, and they've continued being bad, and they've not meaningfully improved. But the question about why they have failed, or why they continue to fail, depends on what level of analysis you want to undertake. So on a field level, the individual field that you're irrigating is not getting irrigated because the canal is broken, or because the yields on the field are not high enough to merit the investment of labour. On a scheme level, when you look at the entire scheme in context, they tend to fail because the low income that is produced by the crops reduces the amount of money available for maintenance because people don't pay their rent or there's less rent available. And because the planning was optimistic about what was feasible or likely or realistic. On a national level, irrigation schemes within a country tend to suffer because government departments are too distant and under-resourced to deal with complicated management issues. And then when you look at the continental irrigation development on a whole, it fails because the schemes are misaligned in their rationales for existence with what the people who work on them want. So people who work on them want to make money, one way or another, whereas the people who fund them want to make lots and lots of rice or cereal crops, which is not the same. That's me.